We can't close those. We'll wait for them to close the doors. There we go. All right. Well, good morning, ladies. It's a wonderful day, and it's even a better day because it's lectureship. Unfortunately, it's going to be the last day. I'm really sad about that because I always look forward to lectureship. It's basically my March Madness since I don't enjoy sports. But anyway, we have a wonderful speaker today. She's going to be talking to us. It's Dr. Anessa Westbrook, and I'm going to have Miss Natalie introduce her. So I hope you enjoy, and please give her your attention.
All right, good morning, ladies. It is my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Anessa Westbrook. She is an associate professor of Bible and Ministry at Harding University. I actually am a former student of hers. I had her as a professor 10 years ago. Ouch. Dr. Westbrook holds a BA in psychology from Harding, a MA in church growth, and a Master of Divinity from Harding School of Theology, a Doctor of Ministry from Fuller Theological Seminary. Dr. Westbrook has spoken at women's events across the country as well as internationally. She has written for Christian Women magazine, is a regular contributor to Mosaic, and is the author of Reaching and Discipling Women, A Guide to Women's Ministry in Your Church. Also, her husband, Dr. Tim Westbrook, was recently announced as the next president of York University, one of our sister institutions in York, Nebraska. So we don't get them in Arkansas for much longer. Make sure that you meet both of them. They're in attendance this morning. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Anessa Westbrook.
Okay, all right. Maybe I had it on and I was just sitting there. So let me get this back on. So good to be with you all today. So I'm excited to be on campus and get to see it. It's been a long time since I've been here, but it's good to be here with you and get to see the lectureship. It's a great excuse to have to leave work and leave my classes. I was able to email my deans and say, I'm sorry, but I will be out of town tomorrow. And so, but it's a real pleasure. All right, I want you to think about the word hindsight. Okay, hindsight. I want you to think about what that means to you. And hindsight, that can be a really big blessing. Don't we have some things happen sometimes and we're kind of wondering, okay, so what's going on? Exactly how is this going to play out? My husband and I have definitely been in a season of we didn't see this coming. You know, what is this going to look like? And it will be very interesting a few years down the road to look back and kind of see what God has done with this time period in our life. But hindsight can be very valuable as we're processing different things that have happened. Oxford Languages defines hindsight as the understanding of a situation or event only after it has happened or developed. Forbes magazine said it is the thoughtful processing of experiences that transforms hindsight into foresight. So that idea of processing. Now we can definitely see hindsight play out in different things that we have experienced. I feel very confident asking most of this audience, where were you on 9/11? You probably know exactly where you were on 9/11. I can't get away with this in my classes anymore. So, but like we were overseas during 9/11. So our experience with it was very different from the experience that happened in the US. But we did see some articles come out, and it was interesting. You know, I remember one specific article, it was talking about how we should have seen this coming because there was an uptick in the amount of cheese people were putting in their carry-ons. These dents, they think plastic explosives like dents and stuff like that, and I thought, is that true? I mean, were terrorists actually trying to get cheese through to see what else they could get through? I mean, like, who knows? But even if that was the case, just because somebody was trying to get cheese through, how could we have ever expected that somebody would turn a plane into a missile? That hadn't been done before. You can't guess that one. You can't see that one coming. Now we see this in the Old Testament too. So 1st and 2nd Kings is talking about the monarchy. And it's judging every king on one thing. And that is how faithful they were to God. And then there are 2 books that are very close to 1st and 2nd Kings. Do you know what they are? 1st and 2nd Chronicles, yeah. So it's very close. It also covers the history of Israel, but with one additional question, and that is, where did we go wrong, and how can we keep it from happening again? And we see this time and time again as things happen. In the news lately, there have been all these issues with airplanes. You know, I still believe air travel is safe. I just think the news is having a heyday with it. But every time something goes wrong, they're going to look back at what happened, and they're going to try to figure out how to keep it from happening again. And so in 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as they review Israel's history, and they're trying to figure out how to stay faithful. This is something that's really important to think about. This is post-exile. They know what it looks like to not be faithful to God. Well, today we're going to be looking in Hosea, and specifically the first part of Hosea chapter 4. And so Hosea is actually at the beginning of the minor prophets. One time, I can't remember how many years ago it was, probably even before you were at Harding, I decided to do a little survey in some of my classes to see what were the weak points in the Old Testament and the New Testament. And not surprisingly, the minor prophets were a weak point in the Old Testament for many of my students. They're little, we often don't hear them talked about, so I'm really happy that that's something that's being discussed this week here. But they're a collection, they're small. There was actually quite a bit of concern with the priests that they're so small they might get lost. So they tried to keep them into a single book. And when they wrote them, they actually had less space between the minor prophets to kind of show this idea of a collection. But even though they're short, they're mighty. Altogether, they're longer than the book of Isaiah, which is pretty impressive. And the book of Hosea is familiar to many, and I'm just curious, I have not read Redeeming Love. You can throw like tomatoes at me later, but like many of you probably read Redeeming Love, and you're familiar with the book of Hosea through that lens. I mean, it's a crazy story, the book of Hosea. Oh my goodness, you know, like what's happening there. Hosea had this unthinkable task of loving an unfaithful woman. Hosea is a faithful man. He is a prophet. And as he was growing up, I guarantee you, he was not dreaming of the day when he would marry a woman that couldn't be faithful to him. And yet through his faithfulness, he accepted this task to be a living example of what faithfulness looks like and how faithful God is. In Hosea chapter 1, verses 2 through 3, it says, "When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, 'Go, marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her. For like an adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord.' So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And they had 3 children." It's always interesting to talk about family names. And my Aunt Priscilla is here today, which I'm so excited about. But we actually have a well-known figure in our family. Her name was Hazel Nut. That was the name that her parents gave her. I love hazelnuts, that's great. But imagine growing up with the name Hazel Nut. Guarantee you she got teased at school. But, you know, it's interesting to see when names actually have a meaning. Our son, we have 3 children, and our daughters are married. Our son is about to graduate from Harding and is preparing to go into ministry, but his name is Theodore Samuel. And when we found out we were having him, we were in a period of very intense prayer about our ministry. And then it's like God gave us a baby. Like, okay, how does this all fit together? We don't know. And so we named him with a Greek name, Theodore, gift of God, and a Hebrew name, Samuel, he listens. And we're still waiting to kind of see how everything plays out with his life. But these 4 kids, they didn't have great names. So the first one, the son, was named Jezreel, which means, soon I will punish the house of Jehu for massacre at Jezreel and put an end to Israel. Imagine walking around with that. The second one was a girl. I will no longer show love to Israel, and her name was Lo-Ruhamah. The third, his name was a son. His name was Lo-Ami, and it meant, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Very heavy names. But despite the judgment, despite the unfaithfulness, God still claimed Israel. He kept coming back to Israel time and time again. Hosea chapter 1 verse 10 says, yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called children of the living God. And this is one of those statements of hope that we see in Hosea. Throughout Hosea, we see this cycling of hope and then judgment, or doom, as sometimes commentators call it. I'm not a huge fan of that word. It just sounds very, heavy. But this is heavy. And so we do have these alternating tones. You see, Hosea is describing a nation that has forgot its first love. It's gotten its priorities out of order in a big way. And they are no longer living their lives according to God's guidance. And as you look at Hosea, you may find an uneasy familiarity with things that are going on in our own culture, or maybe even in our own churches sometimes. And we can learn from Hosea, from Israel, to see where they went wrong. In Hosea chapter 4, verse 1, God gives his case against Israel, naming specific areas where they have strayed from his instruction. And it says, hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, and no acknowledgement of God. And I want you to think about that word, acknowledgement. Hosea 4:2 says there's only cursing, lying, murder, stealing, and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. And an unthinkable connection is made, one which really goes back to the covenant that God made with Israel. If they were faithful, if they would be faithful, God would provide. But in Hosea 4:3, it says, because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea are all swept away. There's no kindness. And if this word sounds familiar to you, there's no hesed. That's how God's described. That is not present. There is not love and loyalty towards God or other people. And in chapter 4, verse 5, it points out something that every time I see this, I'm filled with sadness. Because this isn't an isolated point in Israel's history. But when God was setting things up with Israel, they were supposed to be guided by their leaders. Their leaders were charged with trying to keep them faithful. This would have been true for judges, prophets, kings, priests. That was their charge, to keep them faithful. Yet in chapter 4, verse 5, it points out how little help they were. And he actually says, you stumble day and night, just like your leaders. So let's turn to chapter 4, verse 6. And I want to read a little section here, a bigger section here. And I want you to be listening to some words that are going to pop out a bit repetitively. And I want you to think about what this would be like to live in this situation. He says, my people. Listen to the word my. Despite how they're living, God still says my. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because you have rejected knowledge. And that word knowledge, if you think about what's happening in wisdom literature, that's really one of the central themes of it. How do we become wise? We become wise because of knowledge of God. That's where it all starts. So this is a big word for the Old Testament. Because you have rejected knowledge, I reject you from being a priest to me. And since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. The more they increased, the more they sinned against me. They changed their glory into shame. They feed on the sin of my people. They are greedy for their iniquity, and it shall be like people, like priests. I will punish them for their ways and repay them for their deeds. They shall eat, but not be satisfied. They shall play the whore, but not multiply, because they have forsaken the Lord and devote themselves to whoredom. Wine and new wine take away understanding. My people consult a piece of wood, and their dividing rod gives them oracles. And we can start to see some of the issues that are going on in Israel at this time. Now, an author of Hosea and Micah, Mr. Lindbergh, says that kind of makes a distinction between in this word knowledge. He says it's referring not only to information, but acknowledgement. Okay? Now think about this for a second. We can know what we're supposed to do, but are we actually going to do it? You know? January 1st. Anybody make a New Year's resolution? Sometimes I come up with plans, and sometimes I share with my students that I've made all these plans, but I have a tendency to make more than I can actually keep. I guess I'm a positive thinker. I'm not sure. But we can know what we're supposed to do. So maybe you're thinking, I'm going to be healthier. You know what you're supposed to do, but are you going to do it? So they have knowledge of God, but are they actually going to follow through? And then this word acknowledgement is also very interesting because they have knowledge of God, but they're not acknowledging God. They're not recognizing Him. And so I feel like this word is really interesting. When Israel is rightly related to God, she knows or acknowledges no other, and in fact responds as a faithful wife responds to her husband. He goes on to say, there seem to be certain warning signals that we see when Israel's not following what they're supposed to be doing. One of them is keeping the Sabbath. And I don't know how much time you've spent playing with this idea of what it would actually mean to keep the Sabbath. At one point, when I started teaching my women's Old Testament classes, I got kind of curious what it might be to be a woman who was a Jew who had to keep this. And so I actually subscribed to a newsletter with tips on how to keep the Sabbath, and it came in once a week, and it was really interesting. It's complicated. I mean, maybe you've seen lists of what they couldn't do before, but some of the suggestions, because you can't like have things in your pockets, you can't carry stuff that's like really heavy, you can't tie your shoes, so you'd have to wear slip-ons on the Sabbath, and you would need to like have a little keypad put in your house so you could just like punch in your code to get into your house. You need to think through which lamps do I need the day before, maybe have them programmed so they come on because you can't go turn the lamps on. Of course, this is pretty strict the way I'm describing it, but these are the tips that were coming in. And I don't know if you've ever read through the manual for your oven. For whatever reason, I did once. I don't know why. But there is a Sabbath setting on my oven, and it comes with a recipe. It's like basically a bean-based recipe for something. And if you put it in the night before, then it's going to be ready at the right time the next day for lunch. So you don't have to cook. I've never tried it. And we're moving, so I probably never will. But I thought that was interesting that that was there. But very complicated. Kind of reminds me of when our kids were little. And those of you that have ever packed for a trip when kids are little, how much time does it take? I remember a rule of thumb that was given for me, look to see how long your trip is, and then that's how long it's going to take to pack for that trip. And it seems like if you're just taking a trip in town, like it might seem fairly simple, but it's going to take 2 hours to get it all together. And at the time, so many times, even still, quite honestly, like when we travel sometimes, I'm like, right, is this worth it? Is this really worth it? And then you go, and it's good, because you get a break. You get some different scenery. And I know that that's how the Jews must have felt when they were having Sabbath. But they didn't keep it. Like when they weren't keeping it, they weren't receiving that blessing. But they weren't taking that special effort to do it. Now it's interesting because in Hosea 2:11, God says of Israel, I will stop all her celebrations, her yearly festivals, her new moons, her Sabbath days, all her appointed festivals. And in another prophet, in Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 13, says, yet the people of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not follow my decrees, but rejected my laws, by which the person who obeys them will live. And they utterly desecrated my Sabbath. So we have indication that they're just not keeping it as they should. Further in Hosea, in chapter 10, verses 1 and 2, it says, Israel was a spreading vine. He brought forth fruit for himself. As his fruit increased, he built more altars. So Israel's building altars. These aren't altars to God. And if they were running around building altars, that also wouldn't have been okay, because there were certain places that was supposed to happen. And as Israel's land prospered, he adorned his sacred stones, also not of Yahweh. Their heart is deceitful, and now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will demolish their altars and destroy their sacred stones. And what's so interesting about this is they're doing this as they're being blessed by God. So this is how they're behaving as they're receiving God's blessings. Sound familiar? Now think about that. We'll come back to it. Also, circumcision. When Israel was not maintaining circumcision as they were supposed to, which was supposed to be one of the designations between them and the surrounding nations, then that was a good indicator that they were not being faithful. And in Ezekiel chapter 44, verse 9, it says, this is what the sovereign Lord says. No foreigner uncircumcised in heart and flesh is to enter my sanctuary, not even the foreigners who live among the Israelites. And I feel like that's pretty clear about what God's expectation is on that. They were supposed to do it. They were supposed to be faithful, and it was a distinction. And in Ezekiel 44, as it's like focusing on getting the priesthood back in order, this is one of the designations that took place. Ezekiel 44, verse 12 also says, but because they served them in the presence of their idols and made the people of Israel fall into sin, therefore I have sworn with uplifted hand that they must bear the consequences of their sins. And this is referring to the unfaithfulness of the priests that we've seen referenced in Hosea. And you've probably had an experience with somebody before where you wish they made a different decision. And as a parent, sometimes we have those experiences. As a teacher, I certainly have had those experiences. But I can't imagine what it must have been like for God, who loved his people so much, and then makes this statement in Hosea 11, verse 7. My people are bent on turning away from me. Hosea 13, verse 6. When I fed them, they were satisfied. When they were satisfied, they became proud, and they forgot me. just not following through. One commentator made a very interesting note. He said that as far as circumcision goes, it's interesting because it's talked about a lot when it's surrounding the law, but then it doesn't come up very much, except for when God's calling them to get things back in order. And so this looks like something that maybe they weren't being as faithful with as they should have. Another thing that comes up, which is an indicator that they're not being faithful, is they were living unjustly towards others. And we certainly see this in Hosea. In Isaiah 1:17, it also says, learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. And this is interesting because when we go back into the Pentateuch, in Deuteronomy 10 verse 18, God is described as one who defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And in Psalm 68:5, God is described as a father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. Now, as we're in the minor prophets, one of the things that we see is that they're not defending people. Instead, they're taking advantage of people. And even when we get into Amos, which Amos is a really fascinating book to me, because Amos was a shepherd. And I don't know how much you've looked into this, but shepherds were looked down on because they were with animals all day. I mean, there's probably a sense, to be quite honest. I've never had sheep before, but I can kind of imagine and everything. But they were looked down upon. And Amos, the shepherd, was called upon by God to testify to Israel, to call them back to faithfulness. And one of the things I imagine, since I work in academia, there's a little bit of pomp and circumstance in academia, more than a little bit sometimes, especially at graduation, all highly regulated. But, imagine if somebody, from, I guess, a quick lube place. My husband used to work at one of these in college when we were married, and he would come home covered in oil. And one of the things he said is, it's always interesting to see how people react to me. He walked into a Hallmark store one time, and everybody was like this. He just went in to buy me a birthday card. But, if somebody like that came in, and if they were trying to say, hey, you're not living right, would they accept it? And in Amos, they find themselves, Israel find themselves in a place of blessing. And you see, Israel got kind of confused about some things. There's something called the retribution principle. And basically, if you go back to the law, God says, if you follow the law, you will be blessed. If you don't follow the law, you will be cursed. It kind of outlines what that's going to look like. And so when Amos was prophesying to Israel, they were in, this is my favorite way to say it, I picked it up from somebody else, a rare period of economic security. And it was very interesting. We get little clues, like Amos 3:12 references two items that if you've done any looking into how they actually lived are very unusual: a couch and a bed. They didn't have those things. Amos 3:15, it refers to the winter house and the summer house. Sounds very royal, And then in 5:11, it mentions houses of hewn stone, so they put a little extra effort. Even paneled houses pops up. But Israel, they looked at their blessings and they said, wow, God is blessing us. So that must mean we're living right. Heard of the health and wealth gospel? We have a little bit of this stuff floating around today. And they couldn't see their mistakes because they got caught up in the blessing. And that's what we see Israel doing. Here, they also got caught up with being God's special people. And they forgot that that comes with responsibilities. And so this is something I really think that we've got to think about. I feel like these are messages that that the U.S. needs. Just because we have blessing does not mean that we're living right, that society is going as it should. And Hosea chapter 12, verse 6 says, they must return to your God, maintain love and justice, and wait for your God always. And then further on, the next couple of verses, it starts talking about dishonesty among the merchants. The fourth thing that we tend to see that will indicate that there's a big problem, and that is unfaithfulness and corruption in the priesthood. And that to me is very sad. And one of the things I talk about with my students sometimes is, what would it be like if there was no justice? And I don't know if you all have parking tickets here, but that seems to resonate with my students at Harding. And so one of the things I bring up is, what if you got a parking ticket and there was no way to plead your case? You know, what if there was no justice? And it's just such a sad reality. And then the priests, they could be bribed. Really shows how far they fell. And in Hosea 4, verses 7 and 8, which we read a few minutes ago, the more priests there were, the more they sinned against me. They fed on the sins of my people and relished their wickedness. And it kind of reminds me of a dark period of indulgences, if you're familiar with that term, in a different religious system, where if you were going to go and you knew you'd probably sin, you could just make a payment ahead of time to go ahead and to cover that. But yeah, so the people are going to be like their priests. And then one thing that we see that shows us how God feels about this pops up in various places throughout the prophets. But in Isaiah 1:11, God says, I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fed beasts. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or of goats. And then in the same chapter, verse 13, he goes on to say, stop bringing me your meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, I cannot bear your worthless assemblies. That is so sad. They're doing things, but they don't mean it. Let's say that somebody's trying to make up for something. And for the students in here, maybe there's a guy and he's hurt your feelings and he gives you flowers, but then he's not really sorry. It's just an offering. But there's no real feeling behind it. There's no real desire to change to make it right. That's how God feels. It's meaningless. Meaningless. He doesn't even want it. He doesn't need it. Yahweh is so powerful and so different from the other gods that he is not dependent on people's offerings. And if you kind of think about it from like what an idol is, an idol has no power. So an idol is just something that was made by humans. The only way an idol has power is if people give it power by giving it things and by saying this, it's doing this, or I want it to do this, and giving it power. God's not that. God is God. And he doesn't want things done when somebody's heart isn't in it. All he really wants is our heart. And that's something to think about, seriously. Because sometimes we get really busy. Women, are you wearing more than one hat by any chance? But things get very, very busy. It's very hard. Because we can get so busy doing good things, not to pick on anybody, but we can be like Martha and forget what is better. And I'm a big defender of Martha, by the way. But she was trying to do the right thing. But we overlook what's the most important thing, and that is our relationship with God. We've really got to think about that. Because that's what God wants. God wants our hearts. If he had to choose, just bring me a cup of cold water. But I want your heart. And so the issue here in Hosea 4 ultimately is that Israel is being punished for their lack of faithfulness. They have allowed the world to come in And that is seen in ways that we don't typically see it in our own churches, very concrete ways, idols, sacred stones, and things like that. But I do think it is a call to us to review what is happening. And one thing that I think we have to be honest about is that the church is not in a vacuum. When we feel like our church cannot be affected by the world, that's actually a place of weakness. When we think that we as Christians cannot be affected by the world, we're in a place of weakness. And one of the things I train my freshman girls to do is to review like what's happening. We do something called rolling fasts. And I do it both fall and spring, or have done it both fall and spring. And so what I ask them to do is just 2 different weeks. So 1 week, I have them pick something that they eat or drink that is out of control in their life. Often it's caffeine, it's soda, something like that. And I ask them to remove it for a few days, and then every time they think about it, I want them to pray. And one of the things I've noticed is that when we can get something like more in control and be aware that there could be something outside us that's kind of taken over without us even thinking about it, then that helps make it easier to address other things in our life. And then the next week, they have to choose an activity or some type of an action. And so a lot of people choose social media. Some of them will fast from Netflix or, watching TikToks. That's a new one that's popped up. And so they'll fast from that. And every time they think about it, then they pray, to God. And it's very interesting. The funniest and scariest one somebody chose, and this was when I did it for a week, is she decided to fast from her cell phone, which was good. But she didn't tell her mother. And so her mother called Student Life at Harding, who had to check to make sure that the daughter was okay. And so I had to go ahead and say, if you're going to fast from your cell phone, please tell your mom before you do that. But I'd really sign off on that, but she needs to know so she doesn't worry. So God wants our hearts more than he wants our actions. And our actions should flow out of our relationship with God. One of my women in a women's ministry class, this is years ago, I'm still obsessed with the graphic, but she decided to use a picture of a coffee cup to illustrate this, a really full cup of coffee. And the coffee poured over the side and it left a stain. That's what happens. When we're so full of God, it's just going to come out. It's just going to seep out. There shouldn't be a dichotomy. Who we are Sunday morning should not be somebody different from who we are Monday morning. Who we are Sunday morning should not be different from who we are when we're woken up Monday morning at 2 a.m. We need to make sure that we're working on character and integrity. In Hosea 6:6, God echoes this. And he says, for I desire mercy, not sacrifice, an acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. In Isaiah 1, verses 16 through 17, God calls upon the people to wash and make themselves clean. He says, take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. And as we're facing a world that's very different, where there don't seem to be good boundaries, where there's a thought out there that there's no absolute truth, we know that there is an absolute truth. We're blessed to have that. Imagine living thinking that there wasn't an absolute truth and that nothing was stable. We have something to offer. But we do need to recognize that we have to be careful in a society like this to make sure that we're not moving. You heard of the phrase arm-length Christianity. So we kind of judge ourselves. Well, they're there, I'm here, so I'm good. And then what happens? It moves. It's always moving. And as women, our standards are often set by what's coming in around us. I like to talk about biblical womanhood with my students. And it's a phrase that's not really understood by a lot of people. But we have our womanhood defined so often by what we see, what's on social media, and even how we spend our time is judged by the world. Are we spending our time doing things that we believe to be valuable based upon our understanding of Scripture? Like, that's good. But the world sometimes doesn't acknowledge that that's good. And we feel judged by that. We're not being useful. We're not being productive, it says. We've got to make sure that we're seeing ourselves through God's eyes. And sometimes if we're not feeling blessed, what definition of blessing are we using? I remember my grandma Hobby. It was the first time I ever heard somebody define blessing in a way other than something that was monetary. And she said, I am so blessed because I have great friends and they come and see me and they bring me food. People like to bake for her and drop stuff off because she had tea twice a day and people would show up to have tea with her. And that was a blessing. She lived in a pretty tiny one-bedroom apartment. Her and my grandfather had been career missionaries in Africa. And that was how she defined family. Defined blessing by family and friends. And so we really need to think about what are we defining blessing as. There's so many different ways that God can bless us. And let's not forget Esther. Like, this is really important because we live someplace where we do experience blessing. We may not think it, but just think about what other people are experiencing. And Esther was put into a place for such a time as this. And we may be put into a specific situation or into a specific place for such a time as this. As we're going through and living our daily lives, I just challenge you to really be thinking about some of the struggles that we do see in the minor prophets with them being faithful. Think about Acts 17 and 11. The Bereans, they were considered noble because of why? Because they tested. You know, it's good to ask questions. It's good to test. They were testing the things that they were taught, and they were looking to see if they were correct. We need to be thinking and to be testing, like what the world is teaching, what we're learning, even from religious circles, to see that it is correct. And we need to make sure that we're following God and acknowledging Him in our lives. And that may mean that we need to make some changes to our routine. It could mean that we have to do something that's very hard. Say no, okay? So sometimes we may have to do some weeding in how we're approaching things. Maybe there's something that's actually kind of frivolous that we're doing, and that's actually taking up a lot more time. And I'm not calling it out, but I'm calling out social media and things like that. You can go into a death scroll, if you know what that is, and not come out of it for a long period of time. Maybe we need to work on some of those things. But we need to make sure that we're not guilty, as Israel was, of not recognizing and acknowledging God in our own lives. We need to remember whose we are and make sure we're living that out. God loved Israel, even when they messed up. I don't know if this image will help you or not, but like if there is a little child, like a little toddler or a little baby, and they're doing something wrong, do the parents automatically just write that kid off? No. They might even, they're going to still hold the kid close. They might even try not to smile because it's just so funny what they're doing. But they still love that child. God still loves us, and He's always desiring that we will be close to Him. That's what He wants. Well, let's end our time together in prayer. Dear God in heaven, we thank You so much for giving us this chance just to be here together today as women. And God, I'd just like to ask that You be with these ladies as they leave this place and as they start to think about like what they're doing, how they're doing life, what their priorities are. And I just ask that you help them be able to see a way to spend more time with you, to deepen their relationship with you, and really be able to live the life that you want them to live. One that acknowledges you as their Father and their King, that glorifies you through their actions and their decisions and their priorities. Let us not make the same mistake that we see Israel made as they fell away, but help us be faithful to you always. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you, Dr. Westbrook, for closing us out. Can you guys show your appreciation one more time for her? All right, so I think we're running a little bit better schedule than yesterday. So we've got about 10 to 15 minutes before we start our last session. Please just wait until the gentlemen wrap up before you use the bathroom and go out in there. So until then, mingle, chat, and enjoy your time together while we wait on them. Thank you.
Enough.
Good.